Hi everyone, I am Saniya Kuller, and in this presentation and video, I want to talk to you about a project that I worked on regarding risky behavior, general risk tolerance, and decision-making behavior. And I wanted to give special thanks to Professor Liu and Kanding as well for all their help. And we're all happy badgers here. And like what makes people participate and take risky decisions. What is all of that about? So I'm going to kind of talk about what I did in this project involving statistical genetics and research in this area. So why do people take part in risky behavior? Risky behavior can be thrilling, but it can also be nerve-wracking. So why are you doing this? Why are you taking part in risky behaviors? Why do some people have a desire to do that? Maybe talk to a counselor, maybe work through therapy, try to figure out how to limit the anxiety and the stress, right? And maybe people have risky behavior till they're like age 25, that quarter century life crisis. Sometimes there could be good reason, sometimes there could be anti-social behavior, and then we take risks and it's always stressful, seeing a friend, a loved one, someone taking risks. Some people struggle with not taking risks, they're thrill seekers, and other ones are trying to take more risks. And some people are like, yeah, it's no point, there's no issue, if I fall and I'm dead, that's it, nothing to worry about, nothing to feel too bad about, right? If you fall, you're dead, that's it. But for others, it's like, how can you just take a risk like that? Like, that's scary. So there's a study that's published in Nature Genetics, a very top journal, in 2019. So it's a genome-wide association analysis of risk tolerance and risky behaviors that was done in over 1 million individuals. That's a lot of individuals, a lot of data. So they find hundreds of loci of regions, across the DNA, across the genome, and shared genetic influences. So they tried to look at the self-reported general risk tolerance among individuals in this study. And the sample size in this study, the number of individuals, so it's 466,571 individuals in this genome-wide association study of risky behavior. So they had 23andMe data, which we are not using. So what you can see is this is from the UK Biobank. It's European ancestry subjects. So what they typically found that's interesting is that 34% of males and 19% of females stated that they were risk tolerant, general risk tolerance measure. That means that they can typically prefer some amount of risk. So this is a Manhattan plot of risky behavior. So this is basically summarizing the results across for all these 23 chromosomes, pairs of chromosomes, including the gender chromosome as well. So like every color, so I made it nice and colorful as well. This is the chromosome, and this is the negative log 10 p-value of a single nucleotide polymorphism of our SNPs. One DNA-based pair difference that is statistically significantly found in the in a great percent of the population, like at least 1%. So in this plot, there were some SNPs like RS993137. These are IDs, and they have a pretty significant threshold that is, less than 1 times 10 to the negative 8. So that's pretty huge. And what this is located, this SNP corresponds to the CADM2 gene on chromosome 3, and CADM2 helps maintain cell polarity. The recent studies as well that could say that it promotes tumor metastasis through some FAK, AKT pathway in hepatocellular carcinoma. High levels can be linked with this condition as well. So it's pretty interesting, right? But let's kind of talk more about what this study exactly measured. So it's trying to look at risky behavior in over 400,000 individuals. Some people could have risk aversion, they're afraid of taking risks. They can be risk averse. They don't want to take part in risks. Maybe like you don't want to invest too much in the stock market as much as too scared of collapses. Maybe you don't want to go out during COVID times. You're afraid of taking that risk that you could get COVID. So risky behavior measured by risk tolerance is focused on like what decisions do we make in our lives? Do we decide like Homer to just jump on this, pile of toxic waste, and do we decide to just play karate between SpongeBob and Sandy? What do we think about? That's what risk is, the variance in the outcomes. What decisions do we make in our lives? Our health, our lifestyle choices. Do we decide to go for treatment? If we find out that we have a 20% chance of cancer, do we want children? Do we want to have our children, adopt children? Financial decisions, job decisions, social relationships. So there's a variation in outcomes that can take place. And this question is a self-reported question. So the UK Biobank, they asked these individuals on whom they collected the Genome-Wide Association study information. They asked them this question: would you describe yourself as someone who likes to take risks? Yes or no? So they asked them this question: yes or no? How would you describe yourself? Are you risk averse? Are you risky? How would you describe yourself? So there's a lot of literature as well that people have been looking at. It's like, why are people riskier about financial risk and other investment decisions? Like, what makes people riskier, right? And so one of these articles, Galton was talking about, as an author, was talking about that how firstborns have a tendency to be much more conservative, while later-born children are more risk-seeking. And it's like Alvin and the Chipmunks. So people have been trying to boil this down to a science as well. Like, why do some people take more risks than others? Maybe the firstborn are more sheltered and a little bit afraid, and the later borns, the newer generation, could be more, let's take this risk. I saw what happened with my siblings. Maybe I can try this out, and for whatever reason. So there are all these things trying to figure out why are people riskier than others? Why is it in their blood? And what's awesome about genome-wide association studies is that pretty much anything you're interested in, you can collect the data. There's a lot of ethics, a lot of concerns as well. Like, you can perform a genome-wide association study on baldness, schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, insomnia, even someone's orientation as well, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, like so many things. Maybe also on educational attainment, intelligence, quotient, like other genes that make you more intelligent. So there's a lot of scope for good and for evil. And this study was focused on what makes people seek risks more than other people. So this one was sort of saying, the article was saying basically that the firstborns tend to be more conservative while the youngsters are more risk-seeking. Well, I don't quite agree with that. So as an interesting side, this is my sister. She's testing out a harness moments before jumping off a bridge on an adventurous, a risky activity. So she's my older sister. I call her Didi affectionately. So that's her moments before jumping off a bridge. That's pretty thrill-seeking, right? So that's me many years ago, and that's my sister Didi. And I was also wondering, so maybe that's not just that maybe firstborns aren't always, and not just a sample size of one, but that can't always just be the only reason. Firstborns aren't always like less risky than the laterborns, right? It's certainly not the case here. Sister jumping off a bridge, climbing up here, me looking very freaked out in the selfie. So again, we're trying to understand, why do some people take more risks than others? What is the risk tolerance of certain individuals, And when we're asked this question, how would you describe yourself overall in terms of willingness to take risks, right? Why is my sister, she's testing out the harness moments before jumping off a bridge on an adventurous, risky activity, and that's me too afraid to jump. So we were going on a volunteering trip together in Ecuador, and we tried out a few adventurous activities, and later that's us bonding with the other volunteers. It was sort of a lot of adventure for us. So why is that the case? Why does she seek more thrill, like skydiving, fast roller coasters, and me, I'm always the timid, scared little sister, looking up to my big sister, pun intended. Wonder why? Moments before, like you can see, like it's just like testing out the harness. Really exciting, huh? So this is a QQplot here. And what I did is I sort of looked at this here. And I found that there are a lot of single nucleotide polymorphisms that are statistically significant, more than what we would expect. So there could be a p-value inflation here, and it could be due to the trait being polygenic rather than us failing to account for population stratification. So the intercept does not significantly deviate from 1. So how I found this was from Professor Liu's slide here on LD score linkage disequilibrium score regression. So I performed heritability analysis, and I got the intercept here, and we failed to reject the null here. So there's no evidence of confounding. The null is saying that there's no evidence of confounding, and the significant results that we considered can be more reliable. So given this, we failed to reject the null, and there's no evidence of unadjusted confounding. And so if there seems to be a lot of SNPs that are statistically significant, that can be a pretty good sign that there are a lot of different locations in the genome that are associated with risky behavior. So that's a pretty good sign. There's no confounding. We can kind of rely on the results that we got. Like if we got a lot of SNPs that are significant according to our Manhattan plot, then this is pretty reliable, which is great. So I want to also talk to you about some of the approaches that I did here. So I used LD score regression. I did heritability estimation comparison and genetic correlation analysis. And then I also did partitioned heritability with a focus on cell type specific analysis. So I use bulik LDSC over here on GitHub, which is a really, really great site, really good tool. So they have LD scores, heritability, genetic correlation, and LD score regression intercept, and partitioned heritability. And then they kind of provide a lot of help and insight here as well. So that's how I got my results. So one of my main questions was like, how heritable are certain conditions? And based on this analysis, we can look at like how heritable are certain conditions. So, just think of like the SpongeBob phylogenetic tree of the animal kingdom, Squidward and SpongeBob and some variation of Patrick and Sandy. So, and this is plankton, right? So it's interesting. So we want to look at like how heritable. So I can look at educational attainment, autism, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, COVID positive, hospitalization status. If you have COVID, are you hospitalized or not? Cognitive performance and insomnia, and especially risky behavior. So we can look at the z-score. So it has like a normal bell-shaped curve, and when it's statistically significant, it's around at least 1.96 standard deviations above the mean, which is what this formula is showing here. So you have your point estimate, you subtract the mean, and then you divide by the standard deviation, and that gives you your z-score. So if the z-score is greater than 1.96, that's the same thing as your p-value being less than 5%. So I had a z-score for heritability and the standard error, and then I just subtracted 0, and then I divided by the standard error here, and I got the corresponding z-scores here. So 5.13 divided by 0.22 was about 23.31818. So using this formula here, that's what I got for here. And the question is, so the point estimate, the x value here, the heritability, h squared, is 5.13%. And we see that it's significant for risky behavior, heritability, educational attainment, autism, post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, cognitive performance, and insomnia. It just wasn't significant for COVID. It's just so much of standard error. And again, it's something that we're still studying, trying to figure out the genetic mechanisms of critical illness in COVID-19. Why are some patients having adverse outcomes in the cytokine storm, release of pro-inflammatory molecules, and like extreme and over-exaggerated immune system reaction, but other people don't have it. So why is that happening? So people are still investigating this, but by and large, we notice that these other traits are very heritable. So it's all about how much genetics can explain. So what we can say, especially for risky behavior, which is our focus, is the heritability is significantly not 0. So these SNPs can help account for some of the heritability in risky behavior. So these mutations can help, like these single nucleotide polymorphisms. So around 5.13%, which is what this point estimate is, this value here, this h squared. That's what this is over here. This is the h squared. So about 5.13% of the variation of risky behavior can be explained by common variants like single nucleotide polymorphisms. So that's what we can get here, and then we can see that 11.23% of the variation of educational attainment can be explained by SNPs, and 19.39% of the variation in autism can be explained by SNPs. And we notice like a huge amount for PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, and ADHD. So there's a high heritability, a high genetic component that can help explain some of these traits that we observe. So yeah, it's slightly low, but it's kind of much better than for insomnia. Insomnia is just 4.73% of insomnia can be explained by SNPs, but it's a little bit higher for risky behavior. So there's still a heritable aspect and component to risky behavior. It may be small, but it's still there, and that's important to acknowledge. So this is an example of another work that was done to try to understand factors related to risk tolerance. So for instance, this paper by Jamie Sung and Sherman Hanna was trying to look at the effects of financial and demographic variables on risk tolerance. So they're trying to estimate it for households using a 1992 survey of consumer finances. So they use like logistic regression analysis, different to try to look at different variables, for instance, like gender, marital status, then there's ethnic group as well that they're looking at as well, education. They're trying to better understand like what could be impacting this risk that we notice. Why are some people taking riskier decisions than others? Why are some people more tolerant while others are more risk averse? Like what can determine it? So as they say here, what is the purpose of this paper? Investigate effects of financial variables and individual characteristics on risk tolerance. So there have been a lot of different studies that have been done. So we can look at these financial external factors that are going on. But now in this, I'm trying to talk to you guys about genome-wide association studies. So looking at the DNA level, looking for these differences between groups of individuals who themselves have said if they're risk averse or not, like people who have reported as being very risky. What are the genetics behind that group of people, and how are they different from the people who report not being so risky? So the only caveat is that it's self-reporting. But it's still a way for us to kind of analyze, are there some ways that genetics can play a role in shaping our risk tolerance levels? So genome-wide association studies, summary statistics were used for these other traits and diseases like educational attainment, autism, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, COVID-19 positive hospitalization status, cognitive performance, and insomnia. So basically, with hypothesis testing, we can analyze a correlation R between risky behavior and various other traits or diseases, such as neurological conditions as well. So it's like a competition between your alternative hypothesis and your null hypothesis. So it's like, which one is going to win? And this is your alternative, and they're like, I want to win. So which one is going to win, right? Do we accept the status quo, which is the null? Like it's what things that have typically always been the truth. What is the typical truth that we are holding the status quo? And then this is the alternative hypothesis. So it's a two-sided test. And a significant p-value is at 5%, 0.05, and it corresponds to a z-score of 1.96. So if your p-value is less than, if it's less than this number here, so if it's less than 0.05, or your z-score is greater than or equal to 1.96, then it's statistically significant. So our null hypothesis says that there is no association or significant correlation between our risky behavior trait and this other trait or condition or disease. So by default, we're typically doing the simplest thing, basically. The status quo, the default belief, is the one that's the least interesting, so to speak. It's like There's no relationship between risky behavior and this other trait. There's like nothing there. But that's what we typically believe. It's almost like, oh, this person's innocent in this case. They're not guilty of, doing this crime. So it's just like, yep, everybody's that. And what's the most shocking thing is that, no, this person is not innocent, which is what the alternative is. But the null hypothesis is just the boring, the same old, there's no association between risky behavior and this other trait, Then the Pearson correlation R and the other trait, so it's 0. That's what it is. So we reject the null hypothesis and I'll accept the alternative hypothesis if the p-value for this genetic correlation, so this cross-trait LD score, between risky behavior and the trait is less than our p-value threshold of 0.05, so at the 5% threshold. Or if the z-score equivalently is greater than 1.96, then we're going to reject the null hypothesis. And we're going to go for the alternative. So it's like a little tug of war. So in the alternative hypothesis, there is an association between our risky behavior trait and this other trait. So we usually accept the alternative. So this is a two-sided test here. If your p-value is less than 5%, or equivalently the z-score is greater than 1.96. So in this situation, in the null hypothesis, we said this R equals 0, the correlation R is 0. And so that's the correlation R. But in the alternative hypothesis, we're saying that R is not equal to 0. So these are two outcomes, only one can be true, basically, the null here or the alternative. So there is an association. So this is the interesting thing. And that's what we want to conclude. Like in the US, we have innocent until proven guilty. So we typically are assuming somebody's innocent until they're proven guilty. So that's how our situation works. And a type 1 error would be saying that you kind of rejected the null when the null was actually true. And there's only a 5% chance that we want of making of that error. So the alpha that we're using here is, the alpha is 0.05. So basically that's what we're using, and the Pearson correlation between risky behavior and this trait R is not equal to 0. So it is statistically significant. It can be either positive or negative correlation, we don't know, based on the sign of R, but we can say at least that it's statistically significant. So that is great in and of itself. So that's awesome, because there's some correlation between risky behavior and this other trait. So that's what we want to investigate some more. And this is an example of GWAS statistics for risky behavior that I got from the UK Biobank. So one of the things that I did is I looked at cross-trait LD score regression. So I looked at the genetic correlation, the Pearson correlation coefficient with risky behavior across using a variety of different genome-wide association studies for factors like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism, cognitive performance, COVID based on hospitalization status, COVID positive or not. If you're COVID positive, are you hospitalized or not? That's what this is kind of looking at. Unfortunately, I didn't really get the strongest results from that, which I'll just explain. Educational attainment, insomnia, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So here these are the results in a summative plot where these bars represent the standard error as well below. So for instance, for educational attainment, the Pearson correlation coefficient is 0.0377, and I have plotted that with the standard errors being considered as well. That box there. So what you look at over here is these are the correlations, and then we try to analyze, are these statistically significant? With the z-score that is greater than 1.96, because we're looking at a 0.05, so 5% threshold. So what I was finding, and that's what you see here, is that ADHD, for instance, is significant. ADHD is great. Then there's PTSD, there's cognitive performance, and there is insomnia. So what you can see in terms of the correlations, COVID hospitalization, it's really wide. It's stretching from the zeros up to the positive correlations and then down to the negative. So it's kind of like all over the place there. So it's not really conclusive. So insomnia is positive. Cognitive performance is more negative. It's negative 0.09. So the correlation's like 0.0987. And remember, guys, the Pearson correlation coefficients can go between -1 and 1, where all of these is, this realm is the negative, and this one is the positive. And if it's 0, then it's just like 0, no correlation. So the closer that it is to -1, the more negative the correlation is with risky behavior, and the closer it is to 1, the more positively correlated that trait is with risky behavior. So these are like associations based on genome-wide association studies. How are they correlated with risky behavior? So for instance, we can see that there is a pretty strong positive correlation between attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is ADHD, and risky behavior. That correlation is 0.03725. So that's relatively high, and the p-value is like really small. So it's just so rare of there being a correlation by chance. So there is indeed some relationship between them, some correlation. And with PTSD is slightly higher, so it seems like, you know, PTSD is positively correlated with risky behavior as well. Then you could also see cognitive performance and risky behavior. There's a negative correlation. And then I'm going to try to figure out, well, why do we observe this? And with insomnia, there seems to be a positive correlation between insomnia and risky behavior. So these are the results that I got by performing cross-trait LD score, linkage disequilibrium scoring. So from the previous work that I was showing you in the table of looking at the genetic correlations between risky behavior and different neurological conditions, I wanted to sort of analyze the ones that were statistically significant, such as educational attainment, which, as you may recall, has a genetic correlation of 0.0337. So again, for educational attainment, this is what I'll be focusing around right now, and we're just sort of trying to determine, you know, if you're for educational attainment. This is a star here. We're just trying to determine like what could be impacting. Why is it significant? Why could there be the significant correlation? So what this is looking at is a correlation with risky behavior. And I found that educational attainment has this correlation, this Pearson correlation R. So we are just looking in over here at this educational attainment right here to try to understand why could there be, or what could be some things behind this correlation, this R. And, you know, so we found again the z-score and this p-value. It's not statistically significant between risky behavior and educational attainment, though. But I still wanted to analyze it, even though it's not statistically significant. And you can see that educational attainment may not be statistically significantly correlated with risky behavior because the correlation and the standard errors, it kind of flanks this 0, which is no correlation. So as long as it is covering this 0, that means it could be positively or negatively correlated. We really cannot say. If we look at the standard errors, the z-score is also less than 1.96, and the p-value of 0.1047 is greater than our 5% threshold. So we don't reject the null. There is no statistically significant correlation between risky behavior that we can detect. So it's not significantly heritable as well. So that's what we get looking at the z-score. It's not greater than 1.96. And again, the null hypothesis is that there is, the null is that there's no correlation between the two that is significant between risky behavior and the trait. And the alternative is that there is a correlation. So it's a two-sided test. And so I want to see why could there not be, because there seems to be like some negative correlation between risky behavior and cognitive performance, and then maybe these two can be sort of similar. So why isn't there that relationship? That's what I wanted to kind of see. Why do we get no correlation? So I didn't find any statistically significant genetic correlation between risky behavior and educational attainment. Um, and so there are different papers here on the influence of birth order on financial risk tolerance. And they found that birth order could predict financial risk tolerance, and the results confirmed previous literature in regard to gender and education as predicting risk tolerance. But why could there not be any correlation? So this is a little badger from Wisconsin-Madison, because I'm a happy badger. And the possible reasons could involve hidden variables, like more education could, like if, more education could be associated with having more resources. Like if you're more educated, you may come from a family with greater access to more resources that may be better off. And so there is less at stake for you if you take a risk or you engage in risky behavior. You have more to fall back on. You can afford to take a few risks. If things don't work out, you have people or finances or things you can fall back on. So it's less risk. There's less worse outcomes for you in that case. You have more of a support network or support system there. So maybe having more resources and having less at stake may make you maybe associated with having more education. You can go to the best of schools, have the best of resources, parents and family and guardians who stress, and friends who stress having more education and taking more chances. You may have also had to take a few risks as well. Like perhaps you're pursuing a PhD or a medical degree or a Juris Doctor or higher education, or you're the first in your family to go to school, and you're taking a lot of risks and incurring a lot of debt on the way, but your philosophy throughout is that to get from point A to point B, taking risks can lead you to a better life. Maybe you just have to take the risk. Maybe it doesn't work out, maybe it does, maybe you don't get a job at the end, or you do, but it's just that you've been taught to take risks, that you don't, the only thing, you'll always miss 100% of the shots, like basketball shots, that you don't take. So perhaps that could be at stake, like the more educated you are, maybe you have more resources and there's a less of a stake, or you've been kind of taught or raised to believe in taking a risk for a better outcome. Or on the other hand, it could be that the more educated you are, you have more logic and reasoning on consequences. Like if you have a child, should you really be gambling away the college fund or college tuition that you have, right? So maybe you might be more risk averse. You might know that things may not pan out. You might always want to save. You know that the outcomes or odds are stacked against you. Maybe you don't want to be gambling away in a casino, for instance. So the more education you have, you could have more logic and more reasoning on consequences. Like you don't want to take a gamble. You want to be safe. You want to take less risks. If you have a flight to catch, you want to leave early. You don't want to just be risky about cutting it last minute. So you could be more risk averse. Or even if you could make a bazillion dollars overnight in the stock market, you kind of know that it may not work out for you and hard work is the way to go. So there could be two kinds of behaviors, one that makes you more riskier, and one that could lead you to be more risk averse. So that's why maybe it's sort of like, we don't really know which direction it could go in. So, what is the correlation with cognitive performance and risky behavior? So this is the standard error here, but this is the genetic correlation R, which is already like it's less than zero, so it is negative for sure. So it's a negative correlation. And then what we also see here is that the p-value is so small, it's less than 0.05 for sure. So we definitely reject the null. We do say that there is a statistically significant association between risky behavior and cognitive performance. Now we can see that it's negative, and this is the standard error of this point estimate here for the correlation R. So this is the correlation R again, guys, that's correlation R. And you could see it's really high. Typically the z-score, as long as the z-score equivalently, the z-score is less than 1.96, then that's pretty key. And that's what we observe over here. So what we see here is that cognitive performance is negatively correlated with risky behavior. So typically riskier behavior tends to be correlated with poorer cognitive performance. So it's a negative correlation here. So that's what we see here, and it's some statistically significant point estimate. So why is that the case? So I just wanted to investigate maybe why do we tend to observe risky behavior and poor cognitive performance? So this is a really cute example. I'm a Simpsons fan here. So this is like little Bart Simpson just enjoying putting his feet up on the class, So he's already taking this and fighting with the principal or some teacher here. So he's having the risky behavior of missing classes, not studying, being a bad student. So he's taking that risk when, a teacher is teaching stuff in class, he's just sitting daydreaming in the class. So that's pretty risky behavior. I'll wing it, I'll see how it goes. That's pretty risky. So he's taking the risky behavior, all this risky behavior. And because of this riskiness here, he's failing classes. So, poor cognitive performance. Remember, he was just not paying attention in class, spending time getting up to mischief in school. And failing classes, F, in all of these, right? Here are your grades. So he's really sad, poor cognitive performance. And then he's crying, who am I kidding? I really am a failure. So it may result in poor mental health as a result as well, which we find with a lot of people who take risks that they could end up with insomnia and other conditions. So there's all these linkages here. So this is sort of like how you can do some investigation as to what goes on with people who are involved with riskier behavior and they have poor cognitive performance. And that could be linked to just not studying. And, overall, you just start to doubt yourself a lot.
In general, risky behavior can be destructive. So you could be more prone to behave in a self-destructive manner, like if you've had alcohol or drug use, childhood trauma, neglect, abandonment, emotional or physical abuse, friends or family who self-injure, low self-esteem, social isolation, exclusion. So if you have one self-destructive behavior, according to this article in Healthline, you may have a higher likelihood of developing another self-destructive behavior. So self-harm could be common in a lot of people who may have a mental health diagnosis or may not have it. So teens and young adults are more prone to engaging in physical self-injury, like self-cutting, harming themselves. It could even stem from mental health conditions. So risky behavior can be destructive as well. And in that vein, it was kind of found, as earlier what I'd shown is that there's a genetic correlation between risky behavior and post-traumatic stress disorder. So the correlation is 0.3998. So that's the R value, R equals 0.3998. And what this is here is this is the standard error. And the p-value is 0.0021, so that is less than 0.05, so that is statistically significant. It is significant because it is less than 0.05. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, it typically is a brain condition, and it tends to involve trouble sleeping and concentrating, irritability, angry outbursts, or aggressive behavior. And afterwards, there's overwhelming guilt or shame. So some of this is in response to mental health condition, in response to having traumatic experiences in your past. And you could have intrusions, stressors, avoidance, negative alterations in mood, alterations in arousal or reactivity. You could be reacting to things. It's pretty common that this is happening to you, not just once or twice. It's happening pretty frequently, and you've been diagnosed with it. And it has some functional significance. It's impairing you in your life, and you tend to be feeling excluded from others as well, and you feel a disconnect. So there's a growing body of research that finds that individuals with PTSD are engaging in a number of impulsive and risky behaviors like substance abuse, self-injury, eating disorders, and PTSD and impulsive personality traits may put you at a risk of self-destructive behavior, like taking a lot of risks, and that could be really high, especially in veterans who have been exposed to trauma. They tend to have a lot of PTSD and they may engage in risky behavior. So that might explain why PTSD was one of the traits or conditions with the highest genetic correlation with risky behavior that I had found.
So what is the correlation with ADHD and risky behavior? So that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So it's a pretty high correlation R here. So really high, very, very high R. It's really positive. So it's a really positive correlation here. And the z-score is so high, it's way bigger than 1.96, and the p-value is so small. This is like 6.344 times 10 to the negative 30. So it's so low, guys. It's very small. So it's extremely statistically significant. So we can definitely, we can say it's correlated. Definitely, we can say that. But because it's like so significant, if we were doing a one-sided test, we would probably land up with it just being positively correlated in any case. But I mean, that's what we can conclude. But just, you know, guys, out of principle, because it was a two-sided test, we could just, you know, conclude that it's correlated with risky behavior. I just added the positive because like that's what we noticed, but that's not really good statistically sound technique. But what we just observe is that it's like positively correlated. If we had a one-sided test, then where the alternative is that it's, you know, it's greater than 0, then we could have landed up with that. Like if our alternative instead was saying that then we could have landed up with that. But in any case, so we see that it's positive, and this correlation, and it's significant. So there's a link between ADHD and risky behavior. And in fact, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, what are some of the symptoms and signs? Like in girls, for instance, you can be easily distracted. You can dream off into space. You could be withdrawn. You could forget. Oh my gosh, I forget stuff. You could be like super, super, super talkative and like talking really fast and like, you know, blah, 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 you know, like speaking a mile a minute. Or you can have exaggerated emotional responses to, well, you could blow up sometimes. So there's a lot of symptoms, and it's a really unfortunate, you know, disorder. But a lot of creative people have ADHD. So ADHD-associated risk-taking is linked to exaggerated views of the benefits of the positive outcomes. So in fact, so I was looking in the literature a bit, and I was finding that there is in fact risk-taking that is associated with ADHD. So they say attention deficit hyperactivity and hyperactivity disorder is often assumed to be associated with increased engagement in risk-taking behaviors. So this current study, you know, sought to understand mental processes underlying this, association using theory-driven, you know, economics perspective, and then they're looking at psychological risk return models. So they're using psychology, they're using economics here of like economic perspectives to understand the risk-taking behavior, being risk averse. So there are studies that see this positive correlation here. Also, for managing risky behavior, there's this article as well that notices that people with ADHD are inclined to be riskier in general. You know, you get really motivated by some potential reward and you go out and you try to seek it. And if you take some medication for ADHD, sometimes that can really make you feel very positive, very optimistic as well. You know, increased surge of dopamine, like in Adderall, for instance. So there are articles that help you manage your symptoms with ADHD. Try to limit risky behavior here. So adult ADHD can be difficult to deal with, especially if it is accompanied by risky behavior. In addition to impulsive behavior, risky behavior such as reckless driving, angry outbursts, and unsafe practices are common with adult ADHD. To help find ways to deal with your risky behavior, manage your ADHD with exercise and proper sleep, and properly treat your ADHD. So there are all these help guides. And they talk about how you manage your risky behavior. Get organized, plan ahead. Often the risky behavior could be related to not meeting work deadlines or missing important appointments. Impulsiveness can also help. So they talk about getting a calendar, setting up a routine, just basically trying to minimize the risks that you are unfortunately taking due to your condition. Insomnia was another one of the traits that had a pretty significant genetic correlation with risky behavior. So the z-score was also pretty high, 2.0741, and the p-value was also pretty low here. So that can mean that risky behavior is positively correlated with insomnia. So that is a pretty significant statistical association here. So I was wondering, well, why could this be the case that risky behavior is positively correlated? So that means that R is greater than 0 with insomnia. So that's what I was kind of wondering. Well, why would that be the case? So what I was thinking is perhaps, in insomnia, you really struggle to sleep. So you just toss and you turn and you really just can't sleep. So these are like some of the pillows that I use when I'm sleeping. So you're like this guy, you're not able to sleep, like this little Montana moose, just tossing and turning, unable to sleep properly. So why could there be a positive correlation? So in other words, like people who typically have insomnia, being awake at night, not able to sleep, those people tend to have to be associated with a higher chance for being riskier. Like there's an association, one may not cause the other. So we can just speculate, right? So there's some speculation. How does lack of sleep affect behavior? So studies show that people who are sleep deprived report increases in negative moods like anger, frustration, irritability, sadness. Guys, make sure you get your sleep, your 6 to 8 hours of sleep minimum. So, and decreases in positive moods. So just like having a poor diet, like not sleeping enough can also lead to a poor mental health, poor mental health. So sleeplessness can also be a symptom of mood disorders like depression and anxiety. So if you don't sleep well, it could lead to a worse mood overall, but it can also indicate potentially, but also it could be the reason maybe you don't sleep well because you have depression and anxiety as well. So it could affect your behavior overall though, and risky behavior, perhaps you could be unfortunately like suicidal, for instance, or taking those risks because you're depressed or anxious, or you don't care what happens to you, you're speeding on a motorbike or something. So those are kind of maybe ways that lack of sleep could affect behavior. There are all these things that are interconnected, and there are these latent variables, these hidden variables we don't know, like, or lurking variables, what's really behind the scenes. And then there's another paper here, chronic sleep loss and risk-taking behavior. Does the origin of sleep loss matter? So many adolescents and young adults, it's unfortunate, we don't get enough sleep. A link between sleep loss and risk-taking behavior has been consistently found in the literature, but surprisingly, the role played by the origin of sleep loss in this link has never been investigated. So sleep loss can be voluntary, so instead of sleeping, you can spend more time to other activities perhaps, or involuntary, maybe it's caused by insomnia. So you can probably see that there are these links here as well, and that kind of suggests that sleep, the less you sleep, the riskier you could be. And indeed, perhaps sleeping less, you could be sleeping less as well because of maybe you yourself can cause it. You can be pulling a lot of all-nighters potentially, right? Like all-nighters and risk-taking behavior. So there are a lot of things that are linked. So what I was thinking is some of the things I was also thinking that lack of sleep could lead individuals to have worse judgment and take riskier action. So when you're sleep deprived, you might not make the best decision possible for yourself. You might make poor decisions, and sometimes those can be risky actions because you're not thinking it through. Or perhaps what could happen, like, so this is how insomnia could be potentially like impacting your risky behavior, or one could impact the other impacts it, or it could be going around in a vicious circle, or there could be lots of other hidden variables that we don't even know. Or perhaps it could be spurious correlations, but again, we know that there could be some links, so we're not just going to say it's spurious, some random things, you know, like the number of cows and, you know, the global warming, you know, for instance. Like, you know, two positive trends could just coincidentally be connected with nothing in between, but we do know that here there could be a link. So perhaps individuals, but on the other hand, maybe it's risky behavior that is, you know, one of the causes for insomnia. Perhaps if you take riskier actions, you may struggle with sleeping at night because you're reflecting on the consequences of your actions. So maybe you're up at night tossing and turning, you're like, oh man, I can't believe I did that. I almost died, or this almost happened, or that almost happened. So those are things that maybe that's why we see this between risky behavior, RB, and insomnia, I. We don't know if one causes the other, or is associated, or what else is in between. We don't really know. So bottom line, try to get that sleep, guys. Another application that I did to try to understand the risky behavior genome-wide association study data is to do partitioned heritability with a focus on brain region-specific analysis. So I wanted to annotate specific regions of the brain that could be heritable for a given trait, which here was risky behavior. So I used this gene expression data of the brain, GTEC brain, for 13 brain regions. So I was looking at risky behavior and looking and investigating to see if some brain regions were enriched relative to other brain regions in terms of heritability of risky behavior. So this trait, how heritable is it, you know, in especially does it differ across different brain regions? So as we remember the war between the null and the alternative hypothesis, this is the null and this is the alternative, and it's like a little competition between them. And we have these 13 brain regions. So the competition is basically the null, which is the default, what we believe in, is that there's no heritability between a given brain region and risky behavior. But the alternative is saying that there is positive heritability between a given brain region and risky behavior. So what do we conclude? So the p-value that we typically use again here in this test is going to be at 0.05, but we also need to do multiple testing correction because we're looking at multiple regions. So there are all sorts of issues with that because we're doing multiple tests. We have to correct our p-value. So that being said, what I used is I used the Bonferroni correction. So the Bonferroni p-value threshold is the significant 0.05 divided by 13. 13 is the number of brain regions here. So what we can see here is that essentially the significant p-value that I'm using is going to be 0.003846. And based on that, I test all these 13 brain regions: anterior cingulate cortex, frontal cortex, cortex, cerebellar hemisphere, cerebellum, caudate, basal ganglia, putamen, basal ganglia, nucleus accumbens, basal ganglia, hippocampus, amygdala, hypothalamus, spinal cord, like cervical C1 section, and substantia nigra. This is also really important in Parkinson's disease. So basically, what I was finding is that for these 13 regions, this is the coefficient p-value from it. So ideally, at the 5% level, if we hadn't done the correction, we would have gotten these two as being significant based on this threshold of 0.05. But due to multiple testing correction, because we're testing these 13 different regions, we need to correct our p-value so it's not too high and we're not getting too many false positives, like falsely rejecting the null and going for the alternative. So we need to do a correction, so the Bonferroni threshold. So basically, if the coefficient p-value is less than this threshold, what we're going to do is we're going to then reject our null. So we made it even stricter, more conservative threshold. Instead of this threshold, we've made it this threshold here. And based on that result, we just have this one that is statistically significant. So basically, we found significant heritability enrichment analysis between risky behavior and the anterior cingulate cortex, doing the cell type specific analyses in the brain. And basically, so since the p-value is less than the Bonferroni corrected significant value for the anterior cingulate cortex, this means that the cingulate cortex and risky behavior, there is some heritability that is significant there. Because remember, and that's when that we reject the null and go for the alternative hypothesis. So this is the anterior cingulate cortex. So what does it exactly do? It's typically involved in attention allocation, reward anticipation, decision making, ethics, and morality. It is also associated with impulse control and with emotion. So all of these factors can be linked to the level of risky behavior for an individual. So just based on what this region of the brain does, allocation, reward, decision-making, ethics, morality, impulse control, emotion, all of these things seem to be able to help, with risky behavior. They seem to be intricately connected with that. So, that this sort of makes sense why we could observe that this is highly heritable with risky behavior. So, it can impact it, decision-making abilities, how risk averse or risk tolerant are you, the ethics, are you going to take risky decisions, morality, reward anticipation, do you procrastinate or do you have that self-discipline, what do you do? So the hypothesis is that poor impulse control might contribute to one's risky behavior. So it's possible that having this poor impulse control could make you riskier because you just can't hold it back. You're going to take the risks. And actually, so we've implicated the anterior cingulate cortex as having high heritability, of being heritable, inherited from parents and all, and having strong genetic components with the anterior cingulate cortex. And so I looked up and I found that the anterior cingulate cortex cognitive division fails to activate in attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, which is ADHD. So in normal controls, you can see some level of activation here in this region, but in ADHD, it's just not there. And the anatomy of ADHD, what parts of the brain are involved? Well, in the cortical regions, we have the anterior cingulate cortex that is implicated in ADHD, along with the prefrontal cortex and subcortical regions like limbic system, like amygdala, basal ganglia, and the cerebellum. But the anterior cingulate cortex is definitely implicated in ADHD. So this also kind of shows how interconnected it all is. Like ADHD, strongly positively correlated with a risky behavior, and it's also involves the anterior cingulate cortex, which is highly heritable with risky behavior. So there's like this complex mesh that ties all of these things together, which I thought was really cool because that sort of shows a little bit of the biology and statistics all combined to give us biostatistical analysis. So I really hope that this could shed some more light to you guys on the genetics of risky behavior based on genome-wide association studies and those key findings. And please let me know if you have any questions on this. And I wanted to thank Professor Kyung-Shi Liu, Kunling Huang, and other classmates, as well as the class that I took here in University of Wisconsin-Madison, BMI 826, for all the notes and all the help. And I just wanted to show you guys an example of a project that you can do using statistical genetics. So basically using genome-wide association studies and using statistics and some biology knowledge and some interest in the subject to be able to kind of determine some of the things regarding risky behavior and is it heritable? Are there locations in the genome? So if we're looking at people who are risky and people who are not risky, are there locations in the genome, in the DNA, that we should investigate that could confer this difference in risk tolerance? Because we're trying to understand, are there indeed genetics responsible for what we observe? And this is so important. Genome-wide association studies have been used for insomnia, for ADHD, Alzheimer's disease, baldness, our orientation, are we LGBTQ or not? They've been also used for depression, mental health, you name it, even for COVID, the coronavirus that's causing SARS-CoV-2, the pandemic that we're going through. Are there certain regions? And the idea is you look at people who have the condition and people who don't have the condition or the trait, and try to look at where there are statistically significant differences between those two groups, and try to understand the presence of those SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, where one DNA base pair is significantly different in at least 1% of the human population around the world, so it's pretty common. So instead of having if it's like, ATGC, CA or something, if that's like one of the combinations, then maybe instead in many of the people, this A could be it could be like a C instead, and at least 1% of the people, that's a SNP. So I just really want to kind of illustrate an example of a project on risky behavior that I did, and I just really hope that this is helpful. So again, if you have any questions, please let me know. So all the best for you guys, and that's a little logo, but please subscribe for more updates as well. And I'm Saniya, and I was really happy to be able to help you guys understand an example of a statistical genetics project.